All right. Welcome everyone. Today we're going to talk about how to create a workflow. So in attendance, we also have Tim Aiken on the call today. He's going to be fielding any questions that may come up as we get through this presentation. So if any of you do have questions along the way, definitely jot those down into your attendee hub and send those off. Tim will be going through those. If any of them seem pertinent to ask right away, he'll jump on the screen and he'll relay those to me, and I'll be able to answer them as we go. I'll also try to see some time at the end, a few minutes, to answer any unanswered questions or any that might trickle in towards the end of our time today. Alrighty, so today we're going to talk about just how to build a workflow from start to finish, and we're going to be using the workflow design tool to accomplish this. Excuse me. So what we're going to do, I'm going to go ahead and jump into our Qualtrax demo site that we're going to be playing with today. And for those of you that are not aware, if you don't have the Qualtrax designer tool on your machine already, if it's not already installed, I'll go ahead and show you where to access that. So when you're logged into Qualtrax, you want to go to the upper right-hand corner of your screen, where here it says Roshan Khan, which is me. I'm going to go ahead and click on my name. This will be your name when you're logged in. And then we're going to go to User Preferences. Now, under User Preferences, you're going to see a section for Client Tool Installers. So you're going to have these three installers: Automatic File Transfer Tool, Header Footer Updater, and the Workflow Designer. The third one being the one that we're going to play with today. So you can download these and install them, follow the on-screen prompts to get them installed. Just be aware they work in conjunction with Qualtrax. However, they are separate applications installed on your PC. So like I said, today we're going to use the Workflow Designer. So once you have downloaded and installed this, and if you haven't installed these, I recommend just going ahead and installing all three. You will probably use all of these at some point in time. So I recommend just installing all of them at once. But today, to open up the Workflow Designer, once it's installed, that might be a desktop on your or an icon on your desktop. It could be on your start menu within Windows. If you don't have either of those, you can always go to the Windows search box on the bottom left and just type in Workflow, and you'll see the Qualtrax Workflow Designer app, which I will go ahead and open up. So here we are. This is what the Workflow Design tool looks like. Pretty simple interface here. We have our big open working space, and then we have a series of toolbars, which we're going to jump into here shortly and talk about some of the features that we have inside this application. But first and foremost, before we're really able to do anything with this, other than draw with it, if we actually want this to interface with our Qualtrax system, we need to go ahead and get this program linked to Qualtrax. So in order to do so, we're going to go to the Edit dropdown, and we're going to select Preferences. When I do this, we're going to be on the General tab, and we're having an option for Qualtrax URL and our Qualtrax login. So here I have the URL of the demo site that we're using today. This is where you would put in your URL. Now this is applicable to all of you if you have a hosted site or an on-premise site. For those of you that are hosted, you're going to put in your Qualtrax URL, which is going to be some name.qualtraxcloud.com. For those of you that are on-premise, you're going to have to put in whatever the address is that you access the server. So same idea, you're going to use your Qualtrax URL. Now, you're then going to put in your login name. In my case, it's my first initial plus last name. Whatever your login name is, you're going to put that information here. Now, there is a caveat to this. Those of you that use Qualtrax to manage your passwords, you're going to do exactly what I just said. Go ahead and put in your login name. Some of you might have single sign-on or some sort of LDAP system. Some sort of system where passwords are being managed outside of Qualtrax. In that case, you're not going to be able to log into this application with those credentials. You need to log in to the Workflow Designer with an account managed by Qualtrax. So if you do fall into the category of having an LDAP or a single sign-on system, what you'll want to do is go into Qualtrax, go to Administration, Personnel, and go ahead and add a user. But instead of choosing your LDAP or single sign-on server, go ahead and choose Qualtrax and make a login name for that. And you can repurpose one of your existing ones to do this temporarily if necessary. It's not something you have to go buy a license for per se. You can use an existing license and just switch it if necessary. So just be aware of that. If you're running into any issues with logins and you do have some sort of single sign-on system, that's probably the reason. So just be aware of that. You can only log into this with a Qualtrax managed account. So once you put that information in, go ahead and hit OK. And at this point, your workflow design tool should be linked to Qualtrax, and you can start designing. All right, so let's go ahead and start creating a workflow. Now, I chose a workflow to create today that is not specific to any one industry, probably none of the industries that you're in, but it's something everyone that can relate to. I really don't want you focusing too much on the process. That's why I chose something kind of fun and not super important. I really want you to focus on the process as far as the building and construction of this workflow. So today we're going to build a workflow on how to order a sandwich, something very basic and non-specific. So what we're going to do is we're going to start drawing our diagram. Now, a diagram for a workflow is comprised of two parts, steps and routes. So we're going to start with our steps. Now, to draw a diagram, we're going to be utilizing these yellow shapes at the top of our screen. Now, if you hover over them, you will see that each one has an intended purpose. So for those of you that are really involved in process flow and diagram making, you might be very particular about which shapes you use, which is totally fine. If you are, you have these labels to tell you which ones to use. Others of you might not care, and you might just grab whatever shape looks pretty, and that's fine as well. Either scenario works. These shapes have no inherent functionality. They are just labeled for, your information. They're not going to change the way the process works in any way. So I'm going to go ahead and grab a shape, the starting shape right here, which is the first one. We're going to go and grab that, drag it down into our working space, and drop it wherever we want. From here, you can readjust the size of the shape. You can select it, change the color of it if necessary. Once we label it, you can also adjust the font and the font size, bold and italics. All those typical font options that you have in other applications will apply here. So let's go ahead and label our first route. We're going to label this create order. That's going to be step one of this workflow. Let's go ahead and make this full screen so we have some more space to work with. I'm going to go ahead and grab another step for step two. So I'm going to grab our little square process shape, and we're going to call this review order. And I'm going to grab another one. We'll call this order creation. And grab one more, call this food delivery. And then we're going to grab our final step, which is the concluding step. So I'm going to grab this shape, which is called a terminator step. It's not a T100, just a terminator step. So we're going to go ahead and close. That's going to be our closing step. Now, some of you on the call might be stressing out because these are not evenly spaced. I'm going to tell you, don't worry about it just yet. There are tools that are designed to fix this for us. It's nothing you have to stress about. I know it can be visually annoying, to say the least, but we're going to fix that here shortly. Next thing we want to do is draw our routes. Now, if we click on any one of these shapes, you're going to see 4 blue boxes on each of these. And that's actually where you draw your routes to connect your steps together. So we're going to click on step 1, we'll go to the blue box closest to our next step, and we're going to click and drag our line over to step 2. And we're going to repeat that process to draw all of the rest of our routes. Now, again, I know some of you are stressing out because these lines are not flat. Don't worry about it just yet. We're going to fix all of this. So it's going to look nice and uniform and even. If you spend time trying to line these up, you will pull your hair out because you'll get one straight and it's going to make the other one crooked, and you're going to keep going down the line and it's probably going to get worse. So don't spend any time or effort doing this at all. There are tools in this system that'll fix all this for you. And we're going to do that just now. So we want this evenly spaced and flattened out. So how do we go about doing that? We're going to highlight our entire diagram by just clicking and dragging a box over the whole thing. And then we have these alignment tools at the top of our screen. So the first one I'm going to choose is distribute horizontally. So we'll go ahead and select that. Now everything's evenly spaced. So now we want to flatten out these routes. So I'm going to choose align middle. And now you can see everything is perfectly flat and evenly spaced. Next thing we need to do is label our routes. Now, routes, the best way to think about a route is that is going to be the physical button that you're going to click on to go from one step to the next. So you want to label your routes accordingly to something that makes sense to be on a button. So we're going to click on a route, and sometimes if you played around with the workflow designer, you might realize it can be a little finicky to get that text box to appear at times. If that's the case, just go ahead and click on the outside of the space here and just highlight a box over that area, and that text box will always appear. So I'm going to go ahead and label this one submit order. And once you've labeled it, you can then move that label anywhere you want. You can put it, below or above, or I usually put it above. That's just my personal preference. So let's go ahead and label the next route into food prep. I'm going to move this one above as well. Let's label our third route. I'm going to say ready for delivery. I'll go ahead and move that one up there as well. And then we're going to say order complete. That'll be our final route, which will take us to our closing step. All right. So now we have all of our steps and routes drawn out. Think about steps. These are going to be the pages that have fields for you to fill out data. So you want to really separate those steps according to who's going to be responsible for that data. And then your routes, again, think about it in terms of buttons. That's going to give you a good working diagram to start with. Once you have drawn and labeled your steps and routes, there's one more thing that you need to do before we're ready to bring this into Qualtrax. We need to indicate where this workflow starts and where it ends. So I'm going to go ahead and select step 1, which is the first step. And we're going to go up to our toolbar and select the green line with the arrow that says set as begin state. You'll see it changes that step to green. Conversely, I'm going to choose our closing step and click the next button, which is the arrow with the line or the red line. I'll go ahead and choose that, and you'll see it changes that step to red. Now, for this particular process, it's pretty obvious to all of us that it starts at the beginning and ends at the end. It's pretty obvious where those points are. However, the more complex those workflows get, the less obvious that becomes. Now, the truth of it is that this green and red is not really for us. This is for the computer. We're indicating to the computer where this process starts and where it finishes. And we're going to see where that becomes important a little bit later on. All right, so once we have all of that information listed here, we have our steps, our routes outlined, drawn, labeled. We have our beginning and ending step labeled as well. We're ready to bring this into Qualtrax. Now, there are 2 possible scenarios where you might be bringing a diagram into Qualtrax. The first, which is the one we're going to be doing today, are these two blue arrows that look sort of like the refresh icon in an internet browser. If you hover over it, it says create workflow. What this will do is it'll take this diagram and it'll build the framework of a workflow for you in Qualtrax. The second option, which is this paperclip, this is used if you already have a workflow built and you're just designing a diagram to attach to it. You can go ahead and build this diagram and click this paperclip to attach this to an existing workflow inside the system. So like I said, today we're going to choose this first option that says create workflow. So we're going to go ahead and do that. It's going to ask you to log in. So I'm going to go ahead and put in my Qualtrax credentials. Hit OK. And then we're going to give this workflow a title. So I'm just going to call this sandwich order. And we could also give this a description if necessary. You know, if you create a workflow that everyone might not be familiar with the process, you might want to put a description. Nothing you need to stress about. You can always add this later if necessary. So we're going to leave this blank for now, and I'll choose OK. And now it lets me know it was successfully created. Would I like to open Qualtrax to view it? Yes or no. I already have Qualtrax open, so I'm going to choose no for now. And at this point, we're done with the diagram. However, I always recommend that you save this diagram. So if you go to File, Save As, you want to make sure you save it in its native file type, which is QTWFD. And that stands for Qualtrax Workflow Design File. And it's important that you do save this because inevitably in any workflow building process, you're going to import this into Qualtrax. You're going to start building out the rest of your workflow. You're probably going to add or change something. That usually happens. And when that happens, let's say, for example, you add a step. You're going to want to go ahead and add that new step to the diagram as well. And if you didn't save it, you're going to have to recreate this entire diagram just to add that one step. Whereas if you do save this, you can just open this back up and just add a step onto the diagram. So definitely recommend that you save your workflow design files whenever you create them. So I've already saved this. I'm going to go ahead and close our design tool. And we're going to go to Administration, Workflows. And I'm going to select our sandwich order. And this brings us into what is called the workflow definition. Now, the workflow definition is where all of the content creation as well as editing of a workflow takes place, outside of the diagram, of course. So on this page, there are really three screens here. We have what I call the outline view, which is on the top left. This is going to be all of the steps and the routes based off of our diagram. So we can see based off of that diagram, and I can actually open the diagram up here so we can see it side by side. Step 1 is create order. Our first route is submit order. Step 2 is review. Our second route is send to food prep. You can see all of this matches our diagram perfectly. And that's because Qualtrax took that diagram and created these steps and routes for us. So all that's going to match. So other than listing out our steps and routes here, this is also going to be sort of the basic navigation around this screen. You'll notice all these are clickable hyperlinks. So when I click on step 1, this will take me to what is on step 1. And right now there's nothing there. We're going to change that here shortly. If I click on step 2, it takes me to step 2. If I click on any of these routes, it's going to take me to those route options. So we're going to be using this outline to really navigate around this workflow as we continue to build it out. Now in the future, if we need to add new steps or new routes, we can do that manually here without having to recreate a new workflow with that diagram. All right. So if you think about this like the human body, we have our steps and the routes, which are going to be like the skeletal structure of our workflow. Now we need to add all the muscles and the organs and all that stuff. That's going to be our custom fields. I always recommend when you build a workflow to add all of your custom fields to step 1. So we're going to go ahead and click on step 1. And for the sake of time, I've actually gone ahead and built almost all of the custom fields for this workflow ahead of time, and they're in the system. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add these. So we're going to go to where it says new fields for this step, and I'm going to choose open options. And here are all the categories of custom fields in Qualtrax that I could select any pre-existing custom fields to add to this workflow. Now, a lot of times when you make a workflow, you might not have pre-existing custom fields like I do. And in that case, you're not going to choose open options. You're going to go to create new field, give your first field a title, and then indicate what type of custom field it is, and then choose add. And you're going to continue adding those new fields one by one until you have all of the custom fields for your whole workflow. For me, I'm going to go to open options and we're going to search for all of the ones that I need. So the first one is going to be a personnel field, and it's going to be the name on the order. And I've given all my fields a prefix, so I call these SW just for sandwich, just to keep it simple, and so I can easily find them. So I'm going to select name for order. We're going to add that field, and then we're going to go to a sandwich order form, which I made out of a subform. If you don't know what a subform is a collection of custom fields listed in a horizontal row with the option to add multiple rows of data. So I made a subform in the shape of a order form for sandwiches. So I have like bread type, toppings, sides, those type of things are in this form. We'll see it here in action shortly. So I'm going to go to SW sandwich order form. I'm going to add that. Then I'm going to look for a date and time field, which is called date for delivery. And where is that? There it is, SW date for delivery. We'll go ahead and add that. And then I'm looking for delivery location, which is going to be a text field. And this is going to be where the user is going to put in, their address or possible like instructions on how to find them. And let's see. Oh, look for SW. That's right. I forgot my own prefix. So we're going to go to SW delivery location. We'll add that. Then we have a list field for somebody to check off that they have reviewed the order. So we're looking for SW review order. Or, bear with me 1 second, I apologize. Order reviewed. I left off the prefix. Okay, so we're going to do order reviewed. Consistency, it pays to be consistent with these things. Next, we're going to look for the food prep personnel field. So I'm going to go to the personnel category. We're going to go to SW food prep personnel. And then we have a checklist for the food prep person to check off that they have indeed added all the items to the sandwich. So that's going to be SW order creation checklist. And then we have a drop-down list where that person is going to indicate whether the order is complete or not. So we're going to go to SW order complete. Right there, we'll add that one. And then we're going to have one last field, which is going to be a drop-down list of whether the customer received their order or not. And customer received order. There we go. So now I have added all of the custom fields for this entire workflow to step 1. Now, we obviously don't want to fill out all of this data in step 1. So what we're going to do is we're only going to check the boxes next to the fields that apply to this step. So we don't need any of these below. So we'll go ahead and uncheck this. So in step 1, all we're doing is indicating the name on the order, what type of sandwich we want, the delivery date, when you want this delivered, and the delivery location. That's all that we're going to be filling out for step 1, which is the create order step. So we're going to save this. So we have all of our fields added, and we've checked off the ones that we want to see and edit on step 1. Next, we're going to click on step 2, which is the review order step. And just like step 1, we're going to indicate what we want to see and edit on this step. So this is where we're going to review the order. So we're going to indicate with a yes or a no that the order was reviewed. And then we're going to indicate who's responsible for prepping the food. So those are the only 2 new fields that we're going to add on this step. However, we do want the rest of our fields to be viewable so we can reference that information. So we're going to make them viewable but not editable. So we'll go ahead and save that. Now we're going to move on to the order creation step. And on this, we're going to have that person check off all the items they've added to the food order. So we want them to view and edit that. And then we want them to indicate with a yes or a no whether the order is complete. And just like we've been doing, we want the previous fields from other steps to also be viewable. So you should start to see a pattern here. We're sort of building upon each step. It's the same list of fields. We're just making more and more viewable and editable as we go. And this same building principle will apply when you actually run through this workflow later on. You'll be able to see how it builds on each other. So the next person that's responsible for a step will be able to see the data that was entered by the previous person. And that's sort of a trend that you'll see with workflows that you get from Qualtrax in general. And that's really how we recommend that you build them yourself. So let me make sure I save that. And then we're going to go to the food delivery step. The only information that's being entered here is checking off that the customer actually received their order. So that's going to be viewable and editable. And once again, we're going to make the rest of the fields viewable previously. Now, you don't have to always do that. Sometimes you might choose to make some information hidden at certain points, and that's okay. And other times you might decide to make certain previous fields still editable in future steps as well. You can check those edit boxes there. So you do have really complete control over those custom fields. All right, so what have we done so far? We have drawn out our diagram. We've imported that into Qualtrax, which made all of our steps and routes. We've then gone ahead and added all of our custom fields to step 1, which delineated down to the rest of the steps in the workflow. And then we've checked the boxes according to which ones we want to see and or edit on given steps. At this point, we've created a big chunk. We're about like 85–90% of the way done with building a workflow. The rest of the things here are going to be slight tweaks for how you want this workflow to behave, but the nuts and bolts are here at this point. The last thing I want to do is, or as far as custom fields, is click on our closing step. You always want to make sure your custom fields are viewable in that final step. This is going to greatly help you when it comes to reporting or advanced searching for you to be able to see this data after the fact. So always do that. Okay. So what is the next step in this process? You've added your custom fields to all the steps. You've turned them on according to where you want to see them. Now you want to possibly configure some of these custom fields. How do you go about doing that? Well, if you have two monitors, this is the ideal situation is you want to go to administration, custom fields, and open this in a new window and put this on your second monitor. If you don't have two monitors, you can do what I'm about to do, which is open this in a new tab. That way I can click back and forth between our custom field repository and the workflow. You're going to be looking up your custom fields in this list, and you're going to have to go back and forth a good amount. So I always recommend having two windows open if you can. So what are we going to do? We're just going to go down our list here, and we're going to edit. We're not going to edit all of these for the interest of time, but I will show you the process in which to do this. So the first field is SW name for order. This is a personnel type custom field. So that's what we're going to look for. We're going to go to the personnel category. Then I'm going to scroll down to SW name for order. Now this is a personnel field. You're going to have all of these same customization options for any other personnel field as well. Now, every single custom field, regardless of the category, you can always adjust the title and the description. You can always see what type of field it is, and you can click on show next to usage and actually see where this custom field is being utilized in. In this case, you can see it's being used in the sandwich order workflow and in the step create order. Now, everything below this are going to be the true customizable pieces of this custom field. First one is multi-select. If you ever need to select more than one person or group from a personnel list, you can check this box. For our example, that's not really applicable, so I'm not going to check that. If you don't want to be able to select a person, you only want to see group options, you can choose to show groups only, which is only going to show a list of groups. On the flip side, if you only want them to see personnel, but personnel from a specific group, you could narrow this down by group. So if I only want to see what's in the criminal masterminds group, those are the only choices I'll have if I choose this group. So you have a good amount of options there on personnel. We're not going to modify any of these choices for our example today. We just want to be able to choose anybody. Next, let's look at a subform, and this is going to be the sandwich order form. So we're going to go to the subform category, and I'm going to go to SW sandwich order form. Now, earlier, I sort of gave you a definition of what a subform is. A subform is a collection of custom fields listed in a horizontal fashion with the ability to add multiple rows of data. So here we can see these are actually 4 separate custom fields that are built in the system. We have bread type, condiments, toppings, and cook method. Now, again, I pre-built this before this call. If you are making this from scratch, you would name your subform by going to create new field, giving your subform a title, indicating that it's a subform, and add that field to the list. Now, given the information I just said, these subforms are comprised of several other custom fields. Those are not going to be added to this greater list. Once you create the subform itself, you're then going to go to this custom field page, and if these fields don't already exist in the system, you're going to go down to where it says add a field, and you're going to build these 4 fields here. So you're going to give your first one title, which would be red type. You could give it a description. Then you're going to indicate what type of field it is and add it. That's going to add it to this repository up top. Once you have built all of 4 of these fields, or however many you're adding to your subform, they will then show up in this big list. Now, this is a list of all of the custom fields in your entire system, regardless of category. So you're going to navigate to those fields and select them, and then they will be added to your subform. You could also change the name of the field just for the purposes of that subform. So maybe, for instance, this condiments field you're using in multiple other locations, but for the subform, you want this to be called something else. You could change that name here. So once you've added all of your custom fields to your subform, you can then save it. You can also rearrange the order or possibly remove fields if they're no longer relevant. All right, let's take a look at a different sort of field. Date for delivery, date and time fields. These are everyone's favorite custom fields because they're easy. There's nothing you need to do with them. But let's take a look. We're going to go to the date and time category. We'll go to SW date for delivery. And as you can see, there's not a whole lot of options here. You can adjust your title, your description, and that's it. You can see where it's being used. If you've never seen a date and time field before, all it is a calendar that opens up and you click on a date. So they're very basic, but they do collect important information, and you can use those accordingly. All right, let's take a look at a text field. This is going to be SW delivery location. So we're going to the text category. I'll go to SW. We got a lot of text fields here. There we go. SW delivery location. Good amount of options here for text fields. So we have the typical that we see on every other field. Then everything below here, these are all the options for text fields specifically. So the first one is multi-line. You can see I have that checked here. Multi-line is going to indicate the size of your text box. So if you're looking for like a comments or notes field, in this case, delivery location, multi-line is probably going to be a good bet to give you a larger text box so you're able to type in that data. If you're looking for something smaller, like a person's name, you might not check that box. You probably don't need a whole lot of space. So depending on what you're typing in, you can check that box if necessary. Next, we have display size. And this is actually going to be the width of your text box. So this is listed 600. This is in pixels. So it might take some trial and error if you choose to adjust that. I find that most people leave it default. So you can play around with that if necessary. Very helpful here is the field format. This is where you can indicate the allowable types of text that you can type into this field. Right now it's set to free text, which means you can type anything from your keyboard into that text box. But maybe you're looking for a number. So you can make this numeric and then put in a minimum or maximum allowable value if you want to further constrain that information. That's not relevant to this example, so we're going to go back to free text. We also have an option for default text. This is where you can pre-populate this text field with some information if you want the user to possibly append onto that, or if you want them to adjust that information as needed. You can also put some things in this default text if you just want to give the user some notes and then make this field not editable. That could be permanent text at that point. So you do have some options there. Let's go to list field. This will probably be the last one we look at. The rest of them are the same types of fields that we've covered. So let's take a look at this list field here, which is order reviewed. So we're going to go to the list category, and I'm going to scroll down to order reviewed, which is right here. And here we have a couple options. Multi-select if you want the user to be able to choose more than one option from the list. You can choose that. And then below that is where you can populate the options for your drop-down list. In this case, it is a yes or a no drop-down. If you ever want to temporarily disable an option, you can make it false. You might have some list fields that have some seasonal options, perhaps. You can set those to false when necessary. And you can also check the box if you need to remove any of those choices. All right. So that about covers it for custom fields in this workflow. So again, you want to add all of your custom fields to step one. check the boxes according to where you want to see those fields. And then your third step when it comes to custom fields is actually configuring them, building out your list field choices, setting some parameters around those text options, building out your subform. Those are going to be things you have to do. And even if you don't build a workflow, editing custom fields is still good to know. If you take our best in class workflows, more often than not, you're going to at least edit a handful of those custom fields to make that workflow function the best way it can for you. So this is really good information, regardless if you're building a workflow or just possibly modifying one. All right. So once you're at this point, you are nearly done with the workflow. Next thing we're going to focus on is responsible parties. And what does that mean? So up top, we have an option for responsible parties. Well, I'm going to tell you that depends. Depends on the step. Step one, responsible parties means something very different than any other step in the workflow. So let's talk about what step one means. Step one, you're actually allocating who is able to start this process. So if I go to open options, I'm just going to choose all users and add that as a responsible party to step one, which is create order. This is not saying that everyone in the system is responsible for this workflow or this step. This is just saying anyone in the system is able to start this process. It will show up in their workflow list to be able to launch. That's all that means. Now, once we progress to any other step, it's quite different. So let's go to step two. Step two, or any other step, when you're adding a responsible party, you're giving them certain abilities. So I'm just going to choose the workflow initiator for now, just as an example. You have the option to choose any of your personnel or groups. You also have options to choose personnel custom fields as well. For now, I'm going to choose the workflow initiator, which is the person who started the process. I'm going to add them as a responsible party. So what does a responsible party mean on any other step but step one? Well, you have three abilities, so to speak, as a responsible party. First and foremost, which might be the most obvious, is you can fill out the custom fields that are editable on that step. The second thing they can do is they can save the workflow where it stands and come back to it at a later time if they need to step away for a second. And third, which is probably the most important, is they can click on the route to push the workflow forward to the next step. Those are three things a responsible party can do. They can fill out the fields, they can save it, and they can click on the routes. So let's go ahead and add responsible parties to all of these steps. So on the review order, there is a field where we're indicating the food prep personnel. This is a personnel field. And that person is going to be the one creating the order. So I want whoever is selected in that field to be responsible for that step. So we're going to go to order creation. I'm going to go to responsible parties versus open options. And I'm going to select that field, food prep personnel. And choose that and add that responsible party. So now whoever is selected there is responsible for that step. You want to make sure that field is editable before you get here. So that's good. And then for food delivery, just for the sake of simplicity, I will add myself as responsible there. So I'm going to choose Roshan. I'm going to add that responsible party. And then for the closing step, you don't need to add any responsible parties. You'll see there's not even an option to do so. That's because you'll never actually see this step when you're going through the process. All right. So that's responsible parties. You might notice something below called collaborators. Now, what is that? Collaborators are very similar to responsible parties. They can do almost the same things. Collaborators can fill out the custom fields. They can save the workflow and come back to it. However, they cannot click on the route to push it forward. So then your next question might be, well, why would you ever want a collaborator if they can't push it forward? Well, a couple examples. Let's say you have an intern that you're working with. and they're kind of getting to learn the business. Maybe you don't trust them with this process. Probably not ordering a sandwich, probably a more complex process. If you want them to participate and learn the process, but you don't quite trust them to click on the route to push it forward because they might have some errors in those custom fields, you can add them as a collaborator. And what they can do is they'll get assigned the step just like a responsible party will. They can go in, fill out the fields, and then save the workflow. And then the responsible party can come back in and check their work. If everything looks good, they can click the route and push it forward. Or if there's some errors, they can actually overwrite what's in those custom fields and fix the issues and then push it forward. So that's just one example of why you might choose to use a collaborator. And you might think of some other ones as well. Just as a FYI, you're not always going to have collaborators in every workflow. And to be honest, you might very rarely use a collaborator until one of those circumstances comes up where you might need one. So don't feel like you always have to add a collaborator. You definitely don't. Responsible parties are necessary. Collaborators are not. All right. Next, let's talk about route options. So I'm going to go ahead and hit expand all in our outline there. And like I mentioned before, all of our navigation is done with this outline. And we've been talking about mostly steps up until this point, adding custom fields to a step, adding responsible parties and collaborators to a step. But let's talk about routes. So we're going to click on our first route, which says submit order. Let's talk about some of the options here. First, you can change the name of your route if you ever need to adjust that. You can also change where your route is pointing to. So maybe I add a new step somewhere in the middle of this process, and this route now needs to point to that new step. I can hit this drop down and pick that step and point this route to it. Then you have this route requirement. One responsible party or all responsible parties are the two options. This works in conjunction with your responsible parties on the step. So let's say you have added an entire group as a responsible party on a given step. If we have one responsible party selected, but you have an entire group listed as responsible, what that means is only one person out of that group needs to touch the workflow to satisfy the requirement of pushing it forward. However, if you choose all responsible parties, that means everyone in that group has to touch this workflow before you can push it forward. So depending on how you want your workflow to function, you might indicate one of these options here. Then you have an option for time delay. What this is going to do is it will delay the workflow when you click on the route in the unit of days. So let's say we put in 3 here. What that means is when I click on submit order in this workflow, it's not going to progress to step 2 until 3 days has elapsed. This is one of those options you might not use very often, but when you need it, you definitely need it. So keep that in mind. Next, let's move to requirements for routes. And this is not to be confused with the drop-down I just showed you. This is based around custom fields. This is where you can indicate what custom fields are required to click on this route. And the verbiage I just used is very important. Many people confuse this with this is required for the step. And that is incorrect. These are fields that are required for the route. And that might seem like a subtle distinction, but it's a big one if you have multiple routes on a step. So you're indicating what custom fields that are required to be filled out before you're able to click on that route to proceed to the next step. If you have a step that has 2 routes, it's very conceivable that each one of those routes might have a different list of required fields to satisfy the requirement to move forward. Sometimes they could be the same, sometimes they might be different. So always remember that these field requirements are for the route, not the step. So here, for me to submit the order, I want to indicate what fields are required. So my name, we're going to require that. And then you can see our sandwich order form, the subform, is broken out into the fields that are within that. So maybe I don't want to require the whole subform. Maybe I just want to require certain parts of it. So I'm going to select bread type, toppings, and cook method. Maybe we were not going to require condiments, for example, so we can leave that one out. And then I want delivery date and location to be required as well. So we're going to save those requirements. And now those fields are required for me to click on submit order. Then we have route exceptions. So we've learned about routes in the conventional sense, where you have a physical route, which is a button that you click on to go from one step to the next. You can also route workflows based on list fields. And for one that makes sense, let's jump to a different step here, or a different route. Let's go to ready for delivery. And we're going to open these route exceptions. And these are the available list fields within the workflow. So let's say order complete equals no. Maybe if the order is not complete, we don't want it to proceed to food delivery. That's pretty logical. If it's not ready, you probably shouldn't deliver the food. So maybe we want it to go back to the review order step. We'd probably have a different step in reality, but you can see how this works. We are making an exception to the rule. This ready for delivery route traditionally goes to food delivery, and it will under every circumstance unless you select no in order complete. In that case, we can have it go back to the review order step. That's what a route exception does. Last thing for route options is email actions. Whenever you create a new route, there is this checkbox that says create email action. It's automatically going to design an email action that will be sent out to the responsible party of the next step when that route is selected. Now you'll notice that I didn't even use this create route option to make any of our routes because they all came from the diagram. And as you can see, when you import a diagram to make a workflow, it automatically creates email actions for all of your routes. And if you go ahead and click on this, it's going to open up the email action if you ever need to modify it. So maybe you want to modify who it's being sent to. Maybe you want to modify the text of the email, whether that's a subject or the body. You can manipulate that information as needed. So I'll go ahead and close that. So just be aware you can always access those email actions. You can go straight to email actions under administration to see all of them. Or if you want to edit them as you're going through the workflow, you can click on any of these routes and you'll see an email action listed for each one of them. Okay. Last thing we're going to talk about today is the workflow definition settings. These are sort of some basic rules and parameters that govern the workflow in general. So first, we have the title of our workflow, sandwich order. We can adjust that anytime we want. Here, I told you you can always add the description later. This is where you would do that. So you can go ahead and add that description. We have a link to our diagram. You can always access that if needed or remove it if you want. Then we have a required field. This is the inbox display field. Now, what is that used for? The inbox display field is a piece of data derived from a custom field in your workflow that will be displayed in a user's inbox when a portion of this workflow is assigned to them. So let's say you get to the order creation step and the food prep person has been assigned that step. Based on the field that you select here, they're going to see some information. So I'm going to choose the name for the order. So if I were to create a sandwich order and it made it to any one of these steps, everyone's going to see that this sandwich is for Roshan. Now, there's not really a right or wrong answer here. You're just picking whatever custom field you want to show up in the inbox when a user is assigned a portion of this process. I'm going to go ahead and tell you, you're going to run into some workflows where you might not have a field that makes a lot of sense to select here. You're still going to have to choose something that's okay. Other workflows, you're going to have something that makes a lot of sense, like this one. It also might be something you keep in mind as you're building a workflow. You might specifically design a custom field just to be used for this purpose, and that's okay as well. Just be aware it is required. If you try to put it online without selecting something here, you're going to get a nice little error to remind you to do so. All right. Next, we have the begin and end step. This might sound familiar. When we designed our diagram, I made step 1 green and the last step red, indicating where the workflow starts and where it ends. That information is translated to these 2 dropdowns. So here, the system knows where the workflow starts as well as where it ends. If you were creating a workflow from scratch, not using the design tool, you're building your steps and routes here, you would have to manually define that by selecting it. It's not going to be there for you automatically. Next, we have password verification requirements. Those of you who are FDA compliant, you might be familiar with this checkbox already. It's listed many other places in our software. What this will do is if you check that box, it's going to force you to log in a second time to verify your credentials anytime you process a step on this workflow. So be aware of that. You might also notice expiration. This pops up many different times within Qualtrax as well. Expiration is another term for notification. That's the best way to think about this. You're notifying someone of something. In this case, expiration means in a workflow that we're going to reopen this workflow and send it to somebody. So if we choose yes here, we can actually have this workflow automatically reopen based on some criteria. We can have it reopen on a specific calendar date. We can have it reopen every certain amount of days, weeks, months, or years. Or we could have it reopen on a specific date based off of a date and time field within the workflow itself. If you choose to have it reopen, you then need to define what step it's going to reopen to. And it has to be some middle step. You cannot reopen to step 1, and you cannot reopen to the closing step. So any of these 3 middle steps, you can have it reopen to. And then you can define how many times it will reopen. If you have it set to 0, it's going to reopen indefinitely based on this criteria. If you define a number, it's only going to reopen that amount of times, and then it will cease to reopen. We'll go ahead and turn that off for now. The next 3 items are going to be based on security around this workflow. So to illustrate some of this, let's go ahead and open up some permissions for groups. So if we just go to any group here, it doesn't matter. And we're going to go to properties, and here's our list of groups, or sorry, list of permissions. So the security of the workflow works in conjunction with some of these permissions. This checkbox here, alter workflow instances permission disabled. So before we can understand that, let's talk about what this permission does. So if we go to our groups page, there is a permission that says alter workflow instances. This sort of gives you like godlike powers when it comes to workflows. You will be able to edit any ongoing or completed workflow instances. So if all of us on the call were in the middle of ordering sandwiches and I had this permission, I could go modify everyone's sandwich order to whatever I want it to be. Very helpful for those of you that are, quality managers, but this is not a permission that you want most people in your system to ever have. And even if you do have this permission, you can make certain workflows the exception to this permission. So let's assume I have this permission already. If I check this box, I will not be able to edit any instances of our sandwich orders. So even if you have that permission, you can design certain workflows to be exceptions to that permission. The last two, we have instance access and definition access. Instance access means that you can give personnel or groups access to ongoing instances of a workflow. So if I open options and add a group here, they'll be able to view ongoing instances and possibly edit completed workflows. So if you need someone to do that, you can add them to instance access. And then definition access means you have access to this page that we're looking at right now. So if you need to edit workflows, you probably want definition access. Now this says all users. That doesn't really mean all users can edit this workflow. This means all users that have the workflow definition administration permission. So you need both to be able to edit or modify that workflow. All right. I know that was a lot of information, but that brings us to the end of our discussion for today. Any questions before we wrap up?
Hey, Rich, we did have one, and it was from all the way back at the beginning for the workflow diagrams. The question was, can they create the diagram after? So if they wanted to build the whole workflow from administration and workflow, and then just build the diagram itself after, could they do that instead?
Definitely, yes. So I'll just open up a diagram here. Let's say I've already built this workflow in Qualtrax. I just wanted to make a diagram to match it. I can design my diagram, and then all I'm going to do is hit this paperclip, and you're going to choose the workflow you want to attach it to, and then choose your file type of your choice and hit attach. So yes, you can definitely do that.
Perfect, thank you. And that's all we had.
Awesome. All right. Well, that's all I have for you today. You all enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. See you guys.